CLS Talks.
Talk to me. Talk to me. Talk to me. Talk to me.
Real information.
Talk to me.
Real education.
Talk to me. Talk to me. They don't talk to me. They look like that want it. They don't talk to me. They back. That want it. They don't talk to me. They back. That want it. They don't talk to me. They back. That want it. CLS.
Hello and welcome back to the CLS Talks. I'm Lionel Coveney and I'm joined by Des Carthy. Des, how you doing?
I'm great now, Lionel. Yourself?
Asher, I'm mighty, as the man says. I'm not sure which man, but I'm saying it today. We've been talking about a lot of interesting things with regard to the Gary Doyle Order over the last two episodes, and there are a couple more things that we didn't have on our agenda that I do want to talk about and quiz you on today regarding the story of Tom and what will ensue with regard to his court case. There are a couple of quotes in the book. We are, of course, for anybody who may have missed the last couple of episodes, we're talking about a book called The Gary Doyle Order, which I would recommend that anybody gets their hands on, especially if they plan on listening to all the episodes of the CLS Talks, which I hope they do. You'll find the link to the book on the website and on the YouTube video below, so you have no real excuse not to be able to get your hands on it. So the Gary Doyle Order is the story of Tom, and he gets in a spot of bother on the side of the road with some esteemed members of An Garda Síochána, and he ultimately gets dragged off to the Garda station, arrested and then charged with a number of offences. We haven't got into the Garda station yet, and we haven't got into those offences, and before we do, I want to talk about a couple of quotes that are in the book in the early stages. And then we're going to talk about why did Tom actually stop on the side of the road and what happened there, because it's going to become very important to the listeners as we enter into the nitty-gritty of the legal battle that ensued. So first off, there's a quote by James Connelly which is quite timely considering the year that it is, and we're being bombarded with centenary celebrations to mark the 1916 Rising. The quote from James Connelly, Des, tell us what that quote is and why it's in the book, because it's very, very interesting.
Okay, Lionel, I'll just read it out verbatim, but then we can briefly have a chat about it. If you remove the English army tomorrow, England would still rule you. She would rule you through her capitalists, through her landlords, through her financiers, through the whole array of commercial and individualist institutions she has planted in this country and watered with the tears of our mothers and the blood of our martyrs.
Okay, now, why is that important? I mean, why is it relevant? We all know the English are gone. We all know that we had the Civil War and we had the 1916 Rising, and all those heroes got rid of the English, didn't they?
Yeah, well, English or being English or England or the Crown, whatever you want to call it, is just a turn of phrase. To my mind, what Connelly was saying was that, and I think he actually did say this in some of his other speeches, and it's poignant because obviously the centenary celebrations, is that you can change the colour of the flag above the GPO or above Dublin Castle, whatever it might be, and they in fact did that. But what Connelly was saying was that that is not relevant. Changing the colour of something does not change things. So it has, if everybody looked at this in a critical manner, go back through Connelly's words, or our words for that matter as well, we sort of say this: when the state took over from the Crown, all they did was change the name from the Crown to the state, because none of the institutions changed, none of the capitalists left. They still all have their institutions here. Specifically as well, if you look at the banks, none of the banks are Irish banks per se. They all have perhaps titles and infer they are, but they are not. They're all banks, foreign banks from other countries, from other states. So there is no Irish bank per se. There is no major firms in this country that are Irish per se. They're all capitalists from other countries. They're foreign capitalists, and they're still drawing the money from the country. Now, it's something we discussed a little bit earlier this morning. We had made some calls. Now, it may not sound relevant to people, but I think it is very relevant in the context of what James Connelly said at that time, in referring to just changing the flag colours. But we haven't actually changed the structure of the way the country is operated. That has stayed inherently the same through the legal system as well.
No, I just interject. I know there are people screaming now, and they're saying, but of course we did. We're not under British rule anymore. We're not subservient to the Queen. You're talking, though, about state institutions and how that has continued to be ceded to foreign multinationals in certain cases, or the structures that remain in place regarding the legal system or the banking system. So we're talking about maybe a coating of new paint, as you so succinctly put it. That doesn't change what's underneath.
Correct.
And nothing changed there regarding what's underneath. So when you're talking about specifically Connelly's quote and what has remained 100 years later, am I right in kind of
Absolutely.
surmising that is what you're talking about specifically?
Yeah, specifically, nothing has changed in terms of the financial aspects and the way they remove capital and wealth from the people. That has never changed. On the face of it, it looks nicer because perceivably there is less poverty, there's less people not having their needs met. But people are perceivably happier, we call it that, but the system is still the same, and they're still deriving vast amount of wealth from people through that system being still in place, including the legal system. That has not
so
changed.
the results can only be the same if you don't change the machinery.
Correct.
And you just give it a new coat of paint. The results are going to be the same.
Absolutely, and that's what Connelly was stating back then. So this thing about celebrating the 1916 Rising in the year 2016 and the centenary thereof, the state have hijacked that thing because they don't want people talking about it in the context we're talking about it, that the machinery has not changed, and they like to be in control of that and what goes out on the media. We don't hear the media talking, the broad media, we say the radio, the television, the newspapers, they're not writing or talking about this material. They don't talk about James Connelly in this context. They don't actually phrase him word for word, because if they did, they'd be putting the information out there and people are thinking, all right, it really hasn't changed that much. On the face of it, it looks nicer. Ireland looks like a nicer place to live. But you still have pockets of depravity and degradation and poverty. There is still, those exist in every town in Ireland, if you care to look at it or look for it. They're still there. Now, just this is something I wanted to slip in. I know it's a tangent and you don't mind tangents.
No, not at all.
But we did make a couple of calls the last few days in terms of finding information out. Not specifically necessarily for the Gary Doyle Order, but it does tie into it because it ties into this phrase in terms of nothing has changed. We did ring up and call Revenue and asked Revenue a couple of questions. Now, the specific question we had in mind was in relation to income tax. Where does the money that's collected under the PAYE scheme for income tax actually go?
That's a really good question. Very fair question, actually. I mean, surely everybody has the right to know where their money's going.
Yeah. And the revenues charter, we'll call it for lack of a better word, is that when you ring up, if you ask them a question, a very simple question, and like say asking them for their names because you want to know who you're addressing, they have to give it. Now they're always quite reluctant to do that. And similarly, if you ask them a general question, you say it's a general inquiry, you're not mandated to have to give them any information yourself personally. So you don't have to give them a PPS number. You don't really even have to give them a name. You're protected under the Data Protection Act. You don't have to give that information. And if the question is simple enough, they have to address it. They have no choice. They have to actually address it as civil servants.
Yeah.
Now, laterally, we can put the couple of recordings we did up on the YouTube channel or on the podcast and let people listen to it and see what they think of it. But very simply, and to conclude this section, I suppose, is that we actually got no answers to that question, i.e., what do Revenue do with the income tax they receive or gather or collect under the PAYE system? No answers, but people can listen for themselves and make their own decisions about whether or not the approach was correct, whether or not Revenue were impolite or they were evasive. They can decide that for themselves by listening, I think.
Well, do you know what? Let's have a quick listen to those calls now, in light of what you've just said. And if people can bear that in mind and ask themselves those questions while they're listening to the questions that were asked over Revenue, I think that's going to be an interesting exercise. They're very, very short, so we'll just have a quick listen to them now.
My inquiries there. So can you get your PPS number there, please?
I don't have one.
Okay.
It's just a general inquiry. What's your name, please?
It's David.
David.
Yep. And how can I help you?
David what?
Well, sorry, what's the query in relation to, sorry?
Well, I just need to get on the record what your name is, first of all, David.
It's David Sperrin, why?
Okay, Spern, that's good. David, it's just a general inquiry. In relation to income taxes that are collected,
Yeah.
where exactly does that money go? What is it used for?
What do you mean, sorry?
Well, when revenue collect income tax, where does it go? What is it used for?
Sorry, is this the purpose of the call?
Yeah, general inquiry. It's a fair question, isn't it, David?
Yeah, okay. Do you mind if I pop you on hold for 1 second?
By all means, sure.
1 second. Hello?
Hello?
Yeah, no, I can't help you with that query. That would be the Department of Finance that would deal with that for you.
Well, I am speaking to the revenue. Is that correct? Revenue?
Yeah, this is revenue, yeah, but the Department of Finance deal with them queries. Now, this line is specific for like individuals and PAYE queries. So if you don't have a PPS number, I can't really help you.
But it is an inquiry into income tax, which purportedly is. Hello?
Yeah.
You can hear me. It is a question, a general query in relation to income tax, which is PAYE as well, isn't it?
Yeah.
So why are you trying to refer me on to the Department of Finance? I mean, I'm speaking to...
They would deal with your query. Like, that's just a general query. This is a PAYE helpline for PAYE taxpayers.
Yeah, but
that's it.
Like, I mean, why are you trying to refer me onto the Department of Finance when it's revenue that collect income tax?
We collect the taxes, but we don't spend the taxpayers' money.
Yeah, but what do you do with it? You collect it, so what do you do with it?
Department of Finance.
You're saying to me all the revenue from income tax goes to the Department of Finance?
Yeah.
No, you're not lying to me, are you?
No. Okay, I'm going to end the call here because there's no real specific reason for this.
What? I beg your pardon.
Okay.
Hello, David. Hello? David? Hello?
Yeah.
Hello, who am I speaking to, please?
Cian.
Cian.
Yeah.
What's your surname, Cian?
O'Hara. What's your name?
Hi, Cian. It's just a general question I have for revenue. I spoke to your colleague, David. Is it David Spurren?
I don't know.
All right.
I don't know the man.
All right. Well, look, I spoke to him about 2 or 3 minutes ago, Cian. And the question I have is, what exactly, precisely, revenue do with all the income tax that is collected?
Okay. Hang on a second.
Do you know, just before you go off...
Inquiries, Owen speaking.
Owen, what's your surname?
Sorry?
What's your surname, Owen?
Ward.
Hi, Owen. Listen, Owen, I have a question. I've spoken briefly to your colleague there, David Spurn, and then I phoned back after David hung up and spoke to a Cian O'Hara. And Cian, he said he was putting me, well, I didn't say he was putting me on hold, but put me on hold and then the line went dead. The question I have, Owen, hello, are you still there?
Yeah.
The question I have, Owen, is what exactly, precisely, do revenue do with the income tax they collect?
Sorry, can I get your PPS number, please?
I don't have one.
Okay, well, this is, I would need to refer you to the Revenue Press Office.
Why?
Because I don't personally collect.
No, I know. I'm aware you probably don't personally collect, but do you know actually what happens to the income tax that's collected by revenue?
Well, I'm not at liberty to say that.
Why? Do you know? I mean, do you know what happens to it? Where does it go? Who has it? Who has it? Like?
Sorry, can I get your name, please?
No, I prefer not to give my name.
Okay.
Do you know? I mean, just to be straight, I just want to know, like, do you know what happens to the income tax that's collected by revenue?
Sorry, this isn't the purpose of the PAYE helpline, so...
you guys collect, I mean, it's a PAYE helpline. Now, if I'm to get a PPS number and I'm start paying PAYE,
what do you guys do with it? What do where does it go?
Sorry, this is PAYE helpline.
Yeah.
If you're not a PAYE employee, then you've no purpose.
Yeah, but it's a general question. It's not.
I'm going to have to terminate the call.
Right.
I can refer you to the Revenue Press Office if you need a reply.
Right.
Okay?
Well, just hold on for a second. Right. Just give me a minute. Right. Now. Right. Okay. Now, just relax a minute, because I'm not trying to have a go. I just want to know: do you know, Owen, what Revenue do with the income tax they collect for the PAYE thing? Do you know? I mean, your colleague David basically hung up the phone, and Cian O'Hara put me on hold. It's a question, like, it's a simple question. It's not a complicated question. Do you know? Does anybody know in Revenue, in PAYE sector, what you do? What happens with the income tax that's collected? What happens? What do you do with it?
Sorry, I'm going to have to put you on hold for a second.
So, am I to assume? Hold on, before you put me on hold. Am I to assume? Would it be fair to assume that you don't know what happens to it? Would that be a fair thing to assume?
Well, it's a personal question you're asking.
It's not a personal question. It's a professional question, because if you rang me up and asked me about certain things in the work I do, I'd be able to say to you, I don't know, or I do know. I think they just hung up again.
So, that's very, very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Met with an absolute wall of resistance.
Absolutely. Again, I bring everybody back, the listeners back, ourselves back to the point that James Connelly was making. And really, the point we want to make is, what has really changed? You may ring up Revenue and ask them questions. You won't get answers. I would suggest that back at the time when the Crown were running the country, if you did ask questions of that authority, of the people in that place, they would have possibly taken you out and killed you. As I know that's quite extreme, but Revenue are essentially doing the same thing as are the state. By putting up that wall of silence, or by not giving you any information, they're saying, well, you have no right to ask these questions, whereas you have a right to ask questions and you have a right to get the answers.
Of course you do. That interesting experiment aside then, and the examination of James Connelly's quotes and the state institutions that appear to be almost identical 100 years on, despite the window dressing, there's another quote from Sean McBride which is very pertinent to what we're talking about also. Let's have a look at that one and see why you've put it in there, Des.
Sean McBride was a senior counsel. I don't know if the man is still alive, but it was something we dug out of a book written about Bobby Sands, I think it was. It was in that book, and it was part of the foreword for his book, The Life of Bobby Sands. So it states, this is Sean McBride, senior counsel. Now, again, senior counsel alludes to him being a barrister or whatever, but I just think his words are very pertinent. And there's a phrase in here that is in common usage, but people don't know what it was derived from or where it was coined from. Most people. Now, again, we had to research this and find out where this was. But the quote is, "Centuries of oppression, bribery and duplicity have led to a certain ambivalence in a section of our people that is best described as slave mentality, or the Gombean psychosis." That's the term there, Gombean psychosis. "This makes it difficult to assess the real sentiment of some of our people on certain issues."
Gombean, what exactly does it mean?
This alludes to something and harks back to something we discussed in the last podcast, last recording. It's a psychosis, okay? So it's the psychosis of having that mentality that we talked about in the Milgram experiments as well. You just do what you're told. You have the slave mentality. So that really is what Gombean is getting at, is the slave mentality. It is in common parlance or common use. We've heard it. Politicians use it all the time. The Gombean mentality or the Gombean attitude. And it probably alludes to something else nowadays in the more contemporary use, but that's what it's derived from. It's derived from what Sean McBride said. But he just to state it again, the slave mentality or the Gombean psychosis. So slave mentality as well. I would say that politicians, for example, have a slave mentality. All they're doing is regurgitating the party line. Okay, they don't think beyond, critically, what they're saying or what they're talking about. They haven't given it any critical reasoning, because they wouldn't come out with it otherwise. So that's the mentality they have of being a slave. So just repetitive rubbish comes out of their mouths all the time. Not to state anything clearly, not to solve a problem, but to regurgitate rhetoric that they've been told to give to the people. So that to me is, and it typifies what politicians are about. They have got the gone bean mentality, and they've actually used the term themselves from time to time. Does that clarify?
It really does, yeah. I think we're looking at a broad ignorance with regard to it. And even today, I mean, before you explained that to me, the word gone bean, what it meant to me was just a big ignorant fecker.
Yeah.
And I think that there is a grain of truth in that with regard to, as we now know, where the origins of the word are.
Well, what McBride is saying here, it's very hard to get through to people. You know, when there's ambivalence, when there's a gone bean mentality. I mean, we talked about this earlier before we went on air, and perhaps kind of it's a frustration of mine, certainly, and perhaps of yours, is that we go to the trouble and the effort of doing research and putting material out, and yet we don't seem to be getting the uptake in people tuning in, listening, asking critical questions, because the feedback obviously is very important. Now, we've had a good bit of feedback from the last podcast,
and keep it coming.
Well, we want people to not be asking questions that are already addressed in previous podcasts. So listen back to what's been said, take notes. Then, if you've listened critically, an awful lot of what we're explaining today, for example, would have been previously alluded to, talked about. So it's a build-up. You build up your knowledge over a period of time. You don't get it all of a sudden. So try to avoid asking us questions, repeat questions, if possible. But again, we will try to address those questions as they come up as well. Now, there is no such thing as a stupid question, because I think it's better to ask a question than not ask a question, even if it is a repeat question. But we want people to grow their... this is perhaps both of us, I'm speaking on behalf of here. We want people to grow their knowledge. You don't grow your knowledge over a period of 24 hours. You do it piecemeal. So not just by listening to this podcast, but go back over the other ones that we've done over a period of time. Maybe listen to other stuff as well and compare it to what's out there on the internet. To get back to the point, I think there's a frustration there with Sean McBride when he makes this statement, because like himself, I feel exasperated, or exasperated, is that the word, from time to time, because I just wonder, am I getting through clearly enough to people? I'm sure you feel the same yourself as well.
Of course, yeah. I mean, it can be difficult with family, with friends, and beyond.
Well, family and friends are probably the most difficult, but I know we have people out there listening to this, and we're probably gone off on a tangent again, but this is a point I think, for those that are listening, I think to help yourself as well and to help others, send this information out to everybody. Don't be afraid to call up revenue. Don't be afraid to call up the state departments to ask questions like we would do. We're not just doing this for our own benefit, because I don't need personally to ring up the state departments. I have figured out for myself anyway what's going on. I'm not doing it for my own benefit. I'm doing it to probably further research, but to help other people out there not be afraid to ring up and ask simple questions. As you listen back to the calls that we made the last couple of days to revenue, we didn't give a name. We didn't give a PPS number. We told them clearly that we didn't have a PPS number. So you do not have to give people this information. You're simply asking a question. It's not that difficult to do it. It takes 2 minutes. I think everybody that has a phone nowadays has the facility to record. That's how it was done. It's not a complicated process. So I would suggest that people do that. And by all means, send us in your stuff that you've recorded. We'll edit out the finer details, make sure you're if you do let your name slip, we'll take that out if necessary. We won't allow your personal details to be aired, but certainly I think you'd be up for this as well, Lionel. If people sent us in these recordings of speaking to the state, be it the Garda, be it the different state departments, be it revenue, whomever you like, it could be the water services company, ring them up and ask questions that you think are important to know the answers to. Absolutely.
There's a huge amount of information that can be gleaned, not just from their answers, but also from their non-answers. And it's always worthwhile critically analysing that, because the more you learn from it and the more you understand their position and why they may be refusing to address an issue or to answer a question, the more you can arm yourself with, and the fear is stripped back, because we will talk about fear again and again on this podcast, because fear is the big weapon that the state has. And it's the fear that controls the populace and makes most people pay tax or do whatever it is to do their bidding. And once that fear is removed, power starts to return. And once you've got power and that sense of power, you're able to take on the world. And I really mean that. You're able to absolutely change what it is goes on in your life for the better.
There's a phrase I heard a long time ago, and people say to me, it's you fear of the unknown. And I'm not sure how you can fear something you don't know. I think that's a contradiction in terms. But I think more importantly, people say fear of the unknown. I think it's fear of something changing that they fear. Fear of something different. That's really what people fear. They fear something different. You cannot possibly fear something that you don't know. It's if you think about it critically and clearly, you just cannot fear something you do not know something about.
Look at kids who have no fear.
Yeah.
As they're growing up and developing. The fear of spiders is a great one. Kids aren't born with a fear of spiders. They learn that fear of spiders. They pick it up from somebody else and it's passed on and on, or a fear of rats or whatever it might be. They're absolutely fearless, and quite often the parents of kids, in my observations, they don't encourage a fearlessness. It's almost like, oh well, something bad will happen if you're not afraid. Okay, fair enough. If you're not afraid of the heat on the hob on an oven, you're going to get burned. But isn't it much better to learn most of life's experience through experience as opposed to just being told? Because I think if you blindly accept everything you're told and you accept rhetoric or dogma, well then you're going to continue to do that in later life, and that's why everybody will blindly pay their taxes without questioning why they're paying the taxes or where it's going, etc., etc., and it goes on ad nauseum. So I think kids we can learn so much from kids as well.
That's the gone bean mentality kicking in.
There is the gone bean mentality, and we're not born with it. It's human condition. People will often say to me, oh well, that's the human condition. I agree, but it's not human nature. It's not a natural thing. Condition. Look at the words, look at the language. It's conditioning.
Correct. Now just to close off with the, if you like, quotes, we want to give a little bit of credit to the man that did the foreword in the book, Gabriel Donoghue. He's a prolific writer. He's a very good writer, actually. I think he's a playwright as well. And he did a nice foreword in the book for us. And he then paraphrases a phrase that's in the book. And it's a key phrase here. What it states is, the state perceives and legally treats the people of this island as slaves for the generation of revenue and profit.
Well, if that doesn't frame everything we're speaking about on every episode of this podcast, nothing will. That's so nicely put.
It's just nice and compact.
CLS